He opened the door with a slowness that felt almost rehearsed. His eyes held mine for a second longer than was polite, and in that second, something inside me faltered. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was the way he measured me, as if he knew the precise point where my body began to weaken. I offered a polite smile, but inside, I felt stripped bare. "You're the new nanny?" he asked, his face unsmiling. His voice was a low gravel that seemed to graze against a sensitive nerve. I nodded, suddenly shy, trying to fix my gaze on the floor, on the baby, on the hallway, anything but him. His wife hurried through the daily routine. She had a 3-day trip and trusted completely that everything would be in order. I nodded along, but my mind was consumed by his presence nearby, quiet, observing. As she spoke, he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, like a man who had seen this scene before and knew exactly how it would end. When she left, the silence in the air grew thick. I could feel the weight of his eyes on my back as I settled the baby into his crib. It wasn't invasive. It was worse. It was curious, constant. And right there on that first day, with few words and a great deal of silence, I understood. There was an unspoken promise in his gaze, and I was already listening. He would pass through the living room as if on some other errand, sometimes with a newspaper in hand, other times with a cup of coffee, but I felt him. Before I even saw him, I felt him. The air would shift, the fine hairs on my neck would rise, and my body would grow more alert than my mind. I would sit in the armchair with the baby in my lap, feigning focus on the child's movements, but every cell in my body vibrated when I sensed him there, standing in the doorway, or moving slowly behind the sofa. "Coffee?" he offered once, the mug still warm in his hand. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, trying to sound firm, but my voice came out as a low, wavering breath. He gave a slight smile, and even as he walked away, a part of him seemed to linger in the room. That was the worst of it. He never said anything explicit, never touched me, but his gaze? That gaze left no room for innocence. It was slow, as if it were undressing me in silence, imagining every part of me that did not yet belong to anyone. I would try to think of my fiancé, of our future, of the ring that would soon be on my finger, but all it took was for him to cross the hall and glance at me from the side, with that look of a man who carries secrets for everything inside me to crumble. "You take such good care of him," he said one day, his eyes on the baby. But they were on me, on my lap, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't talking about the baby. It was late afternoon. The entire house seemed suspended in a theatrical silence. The baby was asleep in his room, and the only sound was the warm water running from the tap as I washed a bottle. My shoulders were relaxed, my head empty for the first time in hours, and then I felt it. I didn't see him, didn't hear him. I felt him. His presence behind me was unmistakable. The temperature of the air changed. The heat of his body reached my back before any touch. My body went rigid, but not with fear. It was with something I didn't want to admit, even to myself. I pretended not to notice, continuing to wash the bottle, but his breath was too close. Then it happened. A subtle, deliberate pressure, as if he hadn't touched me, but he had. The shape of his desire pressed against my back, slowly, just enough to leave both doubt and certainty in its wake. My hands trembled, but I kept my focus on the bottle as if nothing had changed. "Is it cold in here?" he murmured from behind me, his voice a low drawl. "No, I'm just distracted," I answered, not daring to turn. What distracted me was the crack, the same one that had started the day he first looked at me. Now it was widening. And as much as my mind screamed for distance, my body no longer wanted to leave. After that moment in the kitchen, I knew I had to say something, to put up a wall, something that would either make him back down or convince myself that I was still in control. I waited for him to appear, and he did. He always appeared out of nowhere, with that calm demeanor of someone who already knows how the story ends. "We need to talk," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. He approached slowly, without surprise, without hurry, as if he were ready. "I have a fiancé." My voice broke on the first syllable. I took a deep breath. I've never been with anyone. The silence that followed was worse than any reply. He wasn't surprised. He just looked at me for what felt like an eternity and then smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile. It was something between admiration and provocation. A slight curl of his lips that seemed to touch places my own hands had never dared. You can remain pure, he said, not blinking, and still feel everything. Those words pierced me like a held breath. I stood frozen, not knowing whether to run or to ask him what he meant. Pure, but feeling everything. How was that possible? And why? Why did that make me want to find out? I spent the rest of the day with that sentence turning over and over inside me, a secret that, once spoken, could never be forgotten. In the days that followed, he changed his rhythm. It was no longer about appearing. It was about making himself felt, even when he wasn't there. It started with stray phrases, tossed out casually, but they landed on me like sparks on dry tinder. You have a beautiful way of controlling yourself, he said one day, as I was folding a diaper. I paused for a second, pretending not to understand, but my heart was already beating to a different rhythm. The next day, as I passed him in the hall with barely a glance, came another. Your fiancé is lucky, but he'll never see you like this. Like what? With my hair thrown up haphazardly? With my shirt clinging to me from holding the baby? Or with my breath short simply because his presence put me on high alert? I began to lose myself in these questions, trying to shield myself from every word, but he always knew the right moment, the right tone. He would strike when I was vulnerable, distracted, or emotionally frayed. And the worst part? He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. All it took was his low voice, the way he called me serious girl with a half smile, for my mind to begin manufacturing scenes I would never admit to out loud. I would mentally repeat the vows I hadn't yet made, trying to hold on to my promise like someone clutching a cracked glass. But my body no longer listened to my own voice. It wasn't his gaze anymore, or that veiled touch in the kitchen. What was corroding me from the inside was the question that bloomed every time he passed too close. What if? I told myself I was still an untouched woman, and I was. But inside, I no longer knew what it meant to be whole. I began to fantasize, not about the act itself, but about the path to it, the shortcuts and detours that would leave me physically intact, but would make me feel. At night, lying in bed, I would relive the moments he called me serious girl, with that half smile of someone who knows exactly how much the phrase unsettles me. And that was what undid me. He knew. He knew what to say, when to say it, and most importantly, what to leave hanging in the air. I started to imagine scenarios, small, theoretically harmless, but dangerous in their details. What would it be like if he pressed his mouth to my neck just to test me? How would it feel to have his hand wrap around my waist with the slow firmness of someone who says, without words, stay? The fantasy of saving myself began to blur with another. The fantasy of allowing myself something. Not everything, but just enough to discover what I had never known. And every time he looked at me with that desire trapped behind his eyes, my will to run grew weaker. Because now, I didn't just want to resist, I wanted to understand. And what if he was the only man who could teach me? It was like an unspoken ritual. Every time the baby fell asleep, the atmosphere in the house would shift, as if the absence of crying released another frequency, slower, denser. And on that afternoon, it was just so. The house was silent, the kitchen clock marking time in dry, hollow ticks. I was adjusting a cloth on my shoulder, trying to distract myself, but something inside me was already waiting. And he appeared, as always, without warning, without rush. He stopped in the doorway and looked at me as if he knew what I had dreamt the night before. For a second, I wanted to ask, "What do you see when you look at me like that?" But the question died before it could form. He approached slowly, his steady footsteps on the cold floor seeming to echo directly in my chest. I turned slightly, but not completely away, and then I felt it. The tips of his fingers traced the length of my spine with an almost cruel calm. It wasn't a caress, it was a recognition, like someone tracing an old map they knew by heart but wanted to revisit every line of. His hand came to rest on my waist, firm and warm. I should have stepped forward, out of the range of that gesture, but I stayed, trapped between what I told myself and what my body was already whispering in silence. He said nothing. He just stood there, his hand resting on me, his gaze fixed. And I was no longer just the nanny. I was the woman he knew how to disarm. My breath was still caught in my throat when I felt the heat of his mouth draw near my neck. It wasn't a kiss. It was something more tense, more subtle. His breath ghosted over my skin, carrying words before they were even spoken. And then he spoke, his voice a low vibration against my ear. If it's only with my mouth, or if we take other paths, you'll still belong to your fiancé. A chill ran down my spine. But my body? My body burned. My body reacted as if it had been given an irrefutable offer. It was cruel, calculated, and it was precisely that which pulled the ground from beneath my feet. My chest began to rise and fall faster, heaving as if searching for air in a room where none seemed to exist. I felt my muscles tense, and the very core of my desire pulsed with a rhythm I barely recognized. I tried to look at him with disapproval, with denial, but my eyes could no longer lie. He moved closer, pressing his hip firmly against mine, as if marking his presence. And that touch, even through the fabric of our clothes, awakened parts of me that had, until then, only known theory. His scent, woody and dense, enveloped me like a blanket on a rainy afternoon. Familiar, yet dangerous. In that instant, my blouse felt far too thin. My breasts responded, revealing what my words would not. For the first time, I thought of using my mouth not to say no, but to discover sensations, textures, answers. My mind screamed for control, but my body had already left logic behind. He didn't ask. He simply guided me with a calm gesture, like a man leading a dance I never knew I could perform. My legs, which had once stood for reason, now obeyed a different command. I moved with him, not because I was led, but because I wanted to go. His hand slid along the outside of my thigh, ascending with a rehearsed slowness, too respectful to be innocent. As it neared the place my thoughts avoided naming, my body trembled, but I didn't pull away. He didn't cross any final line. He only touched, a light but intentional pressure over the thin fabric of my underwear. That was all, but it was enough. I gasped. A sound escaped my throat, impossible to contain. It wasn't just a sigh. It was my body's confession. I turned, needing to see his face, searching for proof that this was real, that I wasn't alone in this fever. And he smiled, the smile of a man who knows exactly what he has done and what he will do next. There was no kiss, not yet, but the heat between us could have set the house ablaze. My forehead rested against his, my eyes closed for a second that felt too long. My mouth trembled somewhere between want and fear, but my eyes were already pleading. Show me what I've never known. Touch me where I didn't know I existed. And in that silence, I understood. The altar was a world away. There was no warning, no word spoken, only that moment when everything else fades into the background. The sound of the baby breathing in the other room, the low light filtering through the window. The world vanished. He approached with the calm of a man in no hurry, for he had already won. He held my face in both hands, his thumbs firm against my cheeks, as if I were made of both porcelain and desire. I felt my eyes close before his lips even touched mine, as if my entire being already knew what was coming. And it came. The kiss didn't start hot. It started deep, like a plunge into water. He kissed me with the devotion of someone exploring a new faith. His mouth found mine with a restrained hunger, like a man savoring the first sip after a long wait. Our lips met with a frightening naturalness, as if they had recognized each other from some long-forgotten dream, and in that instant, something inside me gave way. Not just a piece, but something much larger. My promise was still alive, but it was hiding, tucked away behind a desire I no longer had the strength to control. The kiss said everything our words never had, and the taste of him on my tongue sealed what was already inevitable. There, between touch and breath, I knew. I had already fallen. And worse, I had no wish to get back up. "I want you," he whispered, his mouth still against mine. "Ah, but I want you slowly." My legs no longer felt like my own. My arms were heavy, and what he said next was etched like an echo inside my chest. Every woman needs to know the power her body holds. This wasn't just desire. It was a lesson, a surrender built with care. He wasn't direct. He was deliberate. He kissed me as if my mouth were a secret, as if he feared spoiling the mystery too soon. His hands, firm but slow, roamed my arms, my waist, my shoulders, like someone memorizing a new path. And I no longer recognized myself. My skin seemed to respond before he even made contact. I could feel the heat of his hands approaching. When he traced his fingers along the hem of my blouse, barely lifting the fabric, my body was already in an uproar. But it was when his hand moved slowly upward and covered my breast over my clothes that I lost all control. It was there I understood. Pleasure didn't have to invade. It could be suggested, drawn out. He didn't take from me. He showed me what it was to be wanted with intention. And in that moment, without any line being crossed, I was already his. We didn't do everything, not yet. But what we shared that night was enough for me to understand that some surrenders don't need a final act to be absolute. My body was at peace, and on high alert, as if it had been woken from a long, deep sleep. I could still say I was a virgin. People would say nothing happened, that it was only a touch, only a kiss, only restrained desire. But I knew a line had been crossed, one not found on the body, but within it, in what the body feels. He didn't take my innocence. He awakened it. And that was the true impact. The way he made me feel without possessing me. The way he looked at me afterward in silence, as if he knew I now carried something new inside me. The baby continued to sleep. Time passed slowly, and the house was still just a house. But I was no longer just a bride waiting for the altar. I was a woman who had tasted the edge of the abyss and liked the flavor. And though my promise still existed, it was no longer sacred. It was a choice. And perhaps from that moment on, everything in me would begin to choose differently.